Okay, we're beginning our journey into exponential and logarithmic functions. And we're in chapter section 3-1, exponential functions. And with an exponential function, our variable is in the exponent. And on page 159, on example 1, we're being asked to sketch and analyze graphs of exponential functions. And in addition to that, we're then to describe the domain, the range, the intercept, the asymptotes, and behavior where the function is increasing and decreasing. So I have here this is a guided practice example 1A, and this function is, let's see how I want to do this, 6 to the negative x. So we've got 6 raised to the power of negative x, and I've graphed this, as you can see here on the screen, and this is that graph of 6 to the negative x. So now we're asked now to describe the domain and the range. Well, the domain would appear to be, and is, in fact, negative infinity to positive infinity. There seems to be no limit on our x values. Now, what about the range? Well, the range, we can see that we're going up to positive infinity, but we do see the range here at 0. Now, remember, when we got a negative exponent like this, that makes that a reciprocal function, and we can't divide by 0. So our range then is limited. So we've got a domain. Let's say domain equals negative infinity to positive infinity. Our range is equal to 0 to negative infinity. All right, let's see. What about intercepts? Well, we see an intercept right here at 1. So we've got a y-intercept at 1. And we have a horizontal asymptote at the x-axis. So we've got an asymptote at the x-axis, or 0. All right, let's see. That takes care of domain, range, intercept, any asymptotes. Now, what about our end behavior? Well, we can see here, if we look at this, as x is going to negative infinity, y is going to positive infinity. So our left end behavior is as x is going to positive infinity, negative infinity, y is going to positive infinity. And over here on our right end behavior, as x is going to infinity, y is equal to 0. And let's see, how should we write that? It may be a little bit difficult. Well, if I were to actually write it, it'd look something like this. I got a limit as x is approaching negative infinity, f of x is equal to infinity, and a second limit as x is approaching positive infinity, f of x, or y, is equal to 0. Now, what about increasing and decreasing? Well, when we're doing increasing and decreasing, we're actually looking at our graph from left to right. We're tracing unlike in behavior, where we're looking at the ends here, and this is in behavior, we'd be looking at those two factors. When we're talking about increasing and decreasing, we're just simply tracing our graph, and if we do that, we can see that it is decreasing, and we can say that it is decreasing on negative infinity to positive infinity. Okay, there we go. There is 6 to the negative x. We'll look at a couple of more. Okay, well, this is the second guided practice problem, 1B. I think it was on page, what did I say, 159? I think that's what it was. Somewhere close to that. I lost my page reference now. But it was, we were asked then to graph and look at just 5 raised to the power of x. Yeah, that's 159. 5 raised to the power of x. And we see this graph here. I've graphed this already. This is a picture of the graph. You're following along with your calculator, which you should be. You'll see something just like this. Now, what about our domain? Well, our domain is equal to negative infinity, positive infinity. And I guess I probably should put those in parentheses, be okay. And our range is just like what we saw in the previous graph. The range then is 0 to infinity. We don't see any values of y down here below the x-axis. Let's see, next thing, well, we have again a y-intercept at 1. So we got a y-intercept at 1. We also have a asymptote. At the horizontal axis. All right, we got that part. Let's see, the next thing is end behavior. What's our end behavior doing? Well, as x is approaching negative infinity here, we see that y, or f of x, or I think this is actually g of x, is equal to 0. So I've got a limit as x is approaching negative infinity. G of x equals 0. And then as x is approaching positive infinity, we can see that y is going up to infinity. So we would write it like this. We got a limit where x is approaching positive infinity. G of x, or y, equals infinity. And now we're looking at increasing and decreasing. So remember now we're going to actually be viewing the graph from left to right. And we can say that we are increasing on negative infinity to positive infinity. All right, well, there we go. That's 5 raised to the power of x, and we've described the domain, the range, the y-intercept, the asymptote, the end behavior, and whether we are increasing or decreasing. Okay, one last one here that we're going to look at in this set of examples before you get to work on them yourselves. And now I've got, let's see, I was given that h of x is equal to 1/4, 1/4, raised to the power of x, and then plus 1. Now, one thing that strikes me right here, when you're entering this in your calculator, it is important that you put that 1/4 in parentheses so that your calculator reads that exponent properly. And the second thing is we actually now have a transformation in this function, and we're going to talk a little bit more about transformations in just a moment. But let's look and see what we've got here. Well, our domain, again, we're asked to describe the same thing. The domain's not changed. The domain equals negative infinity to positive infinity. You have to excuse my little infinity symbols. Sometimes they get really sloppy. But I do see a change in the range. In the previous two graphs, if you remember, my range was 0 to positive infinity. But this +1 has actually given me a vertical shift. You can see that the graph has shifted up by that +1, and that affects my range. And so my range now is 1 to infinity. Another thing that I can see is that my y-intercept has moved from 1, which is what we saw in the previous two graphs, to where now my y-intercept is at 2. So this has given me a vertical shift in the graph of my function. Another thing that has changed is my asymptote. It's no longer at the horizontal axis. My asymptote now is where y equals 1. Now, let's see, in behavior. Well, let's see. I got a left end behavior, got a right end behavior. As x is approaching negative infinity, in this case, h of x is approaching infinity, so I've got a limit. As x is approaching negative infinity, h of x is equal to infinity. And let's see, as x is approaching positive infinity, well, what's h of x doing? Equals 1. And now let's see, increasing and decreasing. I'm looking at this graph from left to right, and I can see that it is decreasing on negative infinity to infinity. And that's it. All right, that's negative 1/4 raised to the power of x, and then +1. And I'm going to go over here and look at the table. In fact, I think I'll just jump straight over here. I went ahead and included the table on this one. And you can see here that as x is approaching infinity, we're moving further and further and closer to 1. And I think if I were to go down just a little bit more, about 8 or 9, it would actually equal 1 at that point. And obviously, as x is approaching negative infinity, y is headed to positive infinity. All right, we're marching forward. We'll look at transformations next.